Welcome back to Dylan's World podcast. Thank you guys for tuning in. Enjoy the show. Okay, Judy Grisel, thank you for being here.
I'm happy to be here, Dylan. Thanks for having me.
Indeed. So I was introduced to your TED Talk initially, and then which led me towards your book, which is Never Enough, the Neuroscience and Experience of Addiction. So why can you give the audience a bit of a background on what you do currently, and then we'll dive into the past a little bit.
Sure. At the moment, I'm a professor of psychology and neuroscience at Bucknell University, which is in the idyllic central Pennsylvania, in the middle of nowhere. And I'm teaching a pharmacology class right now. I teach behavior genetics and neuroscience classes and general psychology. I work with undergraduates in my research laboratory and a few master's level students. I have been studying the genetic and other environmental factors, including sex differences, that contribute to a propensity for drug addiction. So I'm interested in what's different about the brains of people who go on to become addicted individuals compared to those who don't. And I'm especially interested in what's different about their brains before they ever take a drug.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's I've been drawn to that topic generally. I'm not a scientist or a professor as in your field, but it's something that I had my own struggles with, and then I saw so many people struggle with in today's world. And also growing up, I grew up in central New Jersey, so I had seen a lot of it. And I want to ask you, just for before we get into some of the psychology and the science, can you detail a little bit of your background and your initiation into this realm of addiction, if you're comfortable?
Oh, sure. I sometimes say I've been researching addictive drugs since I was about 12. So now I'm in a laboratory at a, prestigious university, but I started kind of on the streets, more like you. I took my first good drink at about almost 13 and really was off to the races immediately. I think I probably never said no to the opportunity to take any substance for about the next 10 years. And so between 13 and 23, I was kicked out of 3 schools, 2 in central New Jersey, by the way. Uh, and actually 1 in central New Jersey. The other one, yeah, I had to leave for another reason. Anyway, and then I was homeless. I contracted hepatitis C from sharing dirty needles. I'm lucky I didn't. It was in the 80s. I was using cocaine intravenously, and I'm lucky I didn't catch AIDS or HIV.
Mhm.
Anyway, I ended up pretty at the bottom by my early 20s, and I got to treatment sort of by mistake. I thought I needed a break, and I had this opportunity to go to treatment, which sounded like it might be like a spa. I had no idea. It wasn't so well known, at least to me at that time. So I agreed to go. I got dropped off in the middle of Minnesota and coming from Florida, South Florida. So I was kind of stranded there for 28 days where I learned this possibility that I had a disease that was killing me. And if I wanted to live, I would need to be clean.
Mhm.
And I wasn't so sure I wanted to live at that point, actually, at all. But I was slightly curious, enough curious, I guess, that I thought, well, so if I've got a disease, I'll figure out what's wrong with me and I'll fix it, and then I'll be able to use, which I I think in some ways surprises people, but in another way, I think it's sort of the characteristic perseverance of any good drug addict. I think, don't tell me I'm not going to use. And I just figured when they said disease, I had maybe a tendency to think in biomedical terms already. And it did seem like I was different from the start. So, at any rate, to make a long story short, I decided in my clouded state that I was going to take some advice, do what they said, these people suggested at this treatment center, and then at a halfway house, and then a million other people. I was going to follow directions, and I was going to spend 7 years to cure my problem so that I would be able to use, certainly by the time I was 30. And if things weren't any better, I was going to go back to where I was.
Hmm.
So
Int-
that's how I got
so
to.
you, what do you think was like when you're starting at that age, at a young age? What do you think drew you so deeply into that world versus others? Do you think it's a combination of neurochemistry, trauma, right place, right time? What do you really, if you reflect on that for you and for even for others, what do you think got you so invested into substance use?
Yeah, I would say you just nailed it.
Hmm.
Neurochemistry, trauma, and right place, right time. I think there's three main bins of influence as I see it. I think we come in with certain genetic proclivities, and those are, some of them are kind of boring, like differences in liver enzymes and the way drugs are metabolized. But others that I think I maybe had in spades are a tendency toward novelty seeking and risk taking and not really caring about consequences. So I was kind of always a little reckless, and maybe I still am. So that tendency is innate. It has, it's kind of a set of traits that have a lot
Hmm.
to do with dopamine. So there's the neurochemistry part and other transmitters. And then I think, I didn't have so much trauma compared to some people. So I think everybody, we find that about over two-thirds of people, or about two-thirds, have some trauma history. That's higher in people who go on to develop addiction. Mine was probably middle of the road. I had parents who um, struggled themselves, and but for whatever reason, I was sensitive and maybe a little anxious
Hmm.
and definitely insecure at 12 and 13, like most people are. So it was kind of the time and place for me. And the biggest factor probably was just kind of random event where I was at a friend's house and she thought, "Hey, do you want to drink some of my parents' wine?" Hadn't given it a thought before that I remember, but I said, "What the heck?" And that early experience with mind-altering drugs, especially at the right around puberty and this early adolescence, is probably the strongest catalyzing factor. So most people who develop problems, maybe 90% of people who develop problems, begin using before they're 18. And the
Hmm.
earlier, the stronger the influence. And I think that's obvious now because the brain of kids is so hungry to learn and it's so adaptable, which is, can be for good or ill. And in my case, it took those experiences and really built some major highways.
Hmm. It's
Yeah,
interesting that you say the novelty seeking behavior, and it makes a lot of sense, like risk taking, novelty seeking. Um, to speak for myself, I still have those characteristics, but when I was young, like 14, 15, you don't have I think it's hard to have like the idea of the real consequence of your actions. Whereas now it's a lot more obvious. Like I have to show up to work and for appointments. And like when I was 15, 16, it's just like go to school and then figure it out. And barely, if you even show up to school half conscious, you can make it through. Um, so I'm curious because I believe you said that in the book and maybe even the TED talk that a lot of people who start previous, like in their developmental years, typically develop issues.
yeah.
Is there different neurochemistry involved, or is that just the like what about that being young really catalyzes that potential issue?
Well, there's two things, and you just alluded to both. The first is this tendency when we're young to be high in risk taking and kind of low in thinking through the implications. And that's by evolutionary design. That has to do with a gap in the timing of the maturation of the frontal lobe that's responsible for this like abstract, if I do this, this could happen, might not be good sort of reasoning. So that is kind of slow or retarded to develop. Meanwhile, the limbic structures that are buried deep in the brain that have to do with motivation and emotion and arousal and kind of the drive to be a little uh, exploratory, let's say, that's fully on board. And so, when we're older, they're both kind of, maybe after about age 25, they're both together so that you can balance the tendency to experiment with the kind of solid thinking about what that might happen. But this is by design because it helps young people take risks that they wouldn't if they thought through them all the way, and maybe leave home or, sail across the ocean or, write new music or, pierce
Mm.
this or that. I think we're kind of built during this particular time in our development to be a little crazy.
Mm.
Otherwise, we'd never leave home. And
Very true.
we'd be just like little versions of our parents, and nobody wants that. We don't want that now that we're made it through it. And also, really, it's not good for the world. Young people do kind of shake it up a lot because they have this brain that is immature in some ways. So what happens is we're prone to those kinds of things. Some people more than others by genetic factors. So just they have more risky tendencies to begin with, even though we're
Mm.
all more risk taking when we're young than we are the older we get. But then the second part is that if those risks involve mind altering substances, which are very potent stimuli, then those experiences have lasting impact. And that is kind of a separate thing. And that is that as young people are exploring the world and doing new things, they're deciding this is great, this is terrible, I like this, I don't like her, I do like, him or whatever. And while we're doing that, those feelings are kind of driving brain development so that we form our identity. As psychologists for a long time have recognized that identity is ideally and meant to be formed between about puberty and early 20s. And
Mm.
that's basically a lot of hard work. It's trying things and not liking some and liking others and getting embarrassed and getting dumped and all of that. So when those things we try are mind altering drugs though, they're so potent that they really do impact the brain in a much more powerful way
Mm.
when we're young because the brain is more plastic than when we're old. So if you start using at 30, you can still develop a problem just like you could learn French at 30. It's just a lot harder to do than when you're 13.
Mm. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And you also alluded to marijuana really being a drug of choice for you, of a preference, I should say. And for me too, when I was young, I actually don't really have the tendency or desire to abuse marijuana anymore, even though I can use it, and if I want to, which is interesting because I never really went too deep. But when I was young, cannabis, I abused it, and I want to know from your experience and research, like how does it act on the brain? Why was it preferable to you, and why is it preferable to so many younger individuals based on how it acts?
Yeah. Well, the complicated answer, and I don't know that I can give a full answer,
Sure.
but let's start with the individual differences in risk for individual drugs. Often those go with genetic strengths and liabilities. So, for instance, people who are tend to be anxious or really traumatized tend to especially appreciate sedatives. People who have ADHD or a low tolerance for boredom tend to, I think, like me, really like cannabis
Hmm.
because for me, it was made things much more interesting. Other people who are tending toward anxiety sometimes don't like it. It makes them feel paranoid and they don't want that feeling. I never
Hmm.
felt paranoid. I just felt kind of entertained. So um, I think, people who are in a lot of psychological or physical pain have a increased risk for opioid abuse.
Hmm.
So it kind of does go like that. And there's also, just to be clear, there's also common risk factors for all addictive drugs. So this tendency to want to escape or somehow alter reality, there's a general tendency too. But I think that for me, it was definitely the fact that cannabis made things much more bright and interesting. And that has to do with the way the drug THC, Delta 9 or Delta 8 or 10 or however many more we end up finding, um, that component of the cannabis plant, how that alters brain activity. And that wasn't, this is like the late comer to the um, biological literature because we didn't even know when I got sober how those drugs worked. So it was really the late 80s that people discovered we have endocannabinoids. These are our natural versions of THC, like neurotransmitters that THC is working by mimicking. And those endocannabinoids are fascinating,
Hmm.
very different from other transmitters like serotonin or dopamine in many ways. And we're still learning a lot about them. But I would say that they play a big role in neuroplasticity, which is the changing the activity and shape of the brain to instantiate our experiences. And they are really peaking. The endocannabinoid tone is kind of peaking during adolescence. So just like I said earlier, during adolescence, we're trying to form our identity. The endocannabinoid system is playing a major role in that by helping us sort what is interesting and meaningful to us as individuals and what is, not. And I think the fact that it's different for different people, some people like poetry, some people like guitars, some people like hiking, that kind of liking is probably part of what the endocannabinoid system is responsible for highlighting.
Hmm.
So, make it short, when I smoked at about 13, I liked everything when I was high. I thought it was all amazingly interesting and worthwhile. But that kind of circumvents the hard, tedious process of figuring it out, the the conventional way by doing the hard work of trying classes or experiences. So I could just sit on my couch and be thoroughly
Hmm.
um, entertained. So what that ends up doing is making that natural system for figuring out what matters deaf.
Hmm.
And as that happens, people who smoke regularly, especially as adolescents, tend to get more depressed, more anxious, and less capable of learning.
Hmm. Understood. Yeah, I experienced some of this, and I want to ask you too. I'm not sure how much you delve into this stuff, but although you're a professor of it, but in terms of like the psychology, do you see? do you feel like there's an increase in addictive patterns? Do you feel like people, because from my vantage point with the real screen addiction and social media, and I feel like there's a lot of people who are struggling with meaning. Um, I also know a lot of young people who are doing great. They actually never really went down the deep rabbit holes that my friends and I went into, and they seem to be doing well. But I feel like, do you think this psychologically, like there's a collapse in meaning, and then there's screen addiction? Do you think that's contributing more and more to people struggling? Is that a clear question?
Yeah, it is clear. I'm very interested, before I answer the question, in those people who are doing really well, because I'd love to know now what's different about them to begin with, and is it their experiences or their genes or just dumb luck? In fact, the tendency to use, as you said, either digital or pharmacological tools is increasing, as is kind of despair, especially among young people. And especially, yeah, it does. It seems like so that the incidence is going up, and there's little blips here and there. And I don't think it's worth getting all tied up in, oh, there was a slight drop in 2023 compared to 2022, because the overall trajectory is pretty bleak.
Hmm.
Up to 40 or 50% of young people are struggling with mental health issues. And recently, I think in 2022, the daily or near daily use of cannabis by people in the US surpassed the daily or near daily use of alcohol. So we're not seeing, we are seeing, I guess, people using more and more. And the
Hmm.
digital stuff is another topic, and the pornography is another, way that people are trying to cope with stress. And I do think that stress is increasing. I know that, there's this notion that our grandparents said, well, every generation thinks that it's very stressful, and surely living is stressful. But I think the young people, especially today, are really struggling. And so they're looking for ways to feel better, and in that process using. And then the big dilemma is that the using backfires if you do it too much. And so, initially my drinking and smoking and everything else was, a great diversion, but eventually it was the only way to kind of get by. And that is an inevitable consequence of how the brain counteracts these sort of escape things. So I think, we don't feel meaning. We can generate that in a kind of a false way, like by taking drugs or, social media, let's say. And that false way, though, undermines our capacity to sense meaning overall. So it's kind of a downward spiral.
Hmm. Yeah, the mental health issues are troubling. I mean, it's simultaneously, I feel like we live in one of the best times, if we leverage the modern world in the correct direction, but where people have issues, and especially if you're young and you grew up in this, you have so much data coming in from your devices. You're not outside enough. You're like, there's so much coming at you, and so much is negative, or it appears negative, that it's hard to know what's true. And then some behaviors are rewarded that are actually genuinely harmful. So it looks positive to party and to celebrate and to like to abuse substances. It's not. I think it differs. Obviously, there were issues back when, but it differs from like that 70s view of hanging out outside and having beers and smoking. Like, obviously, that can lead to harm, but it's like there was a sense of connection that I think now is becoming isolation and screen addiction. And it's it's hard to see. Do you do you know how that's acting on the brain of young people? Is there
Well,
something?
I meet students all the time. I had one in my office a week or two ago who, freshman, male, who had been so occupied with online pornography that wasn't really able, he felt unable to connect with actual girls, which
Mhm.
was his interest. And when he did connect a little bit, he wasn't able to kind of perform in a way that was satisfying to him or to her. And he wondered what the consequences of, many hours of
Mhm.
virtual engagement were. And I think it's a perfect parallel to the substances, because what he craved all along was connection, physical, sexual connection. I guess you could say intimacy. That is what we, are built to do. And finding intimacy when you're 14, 15, 16, 17 is hard.
Mhm.
I mean, when I was young, we didn't, the phones were mounted to the wall. So there was nothing like what it is. It took, awkward conversations and, in the lunchroom. So it's hard. And, but not now. Now you can kind of generate a really powerful feeling very close to an actual warm human being with your screen. And that's so powerful and so easy. Just like dabbing, cannabis is so easy, or fentanyl is, so the stimuli are so potent and so readily available that they're really compelling, especially to a 15-year-old who doesn't want to do the hard work of, actually talking to girls and getting rejected or saying something stupid, which is
Mhm.
totally understandable. So then he gets to college, and it's uh, a new playing field, and he has no skills and no tools. So what I said, and it's the same with substances, is terrific that he's 18. His brain is really still plastic and wide open, and kind of, in other words, built to be making those actual intimate connections, and that it might take a little time. So be patient and find someone who's patient a little bit too, and you know comes back, I think. But certainly the longer we uh, so I think it's a combination. I think there is stress, and there's the tools are so available
Mhm.
and so potent that we almost feel like we can circumvent the hard work of making a meaningful life
Mhm.
by mimicking one with, you know, whatever tool we pick up.
That's one thing that I find sort of sad and disconnective is how if you go to a coffee shop, and I'm guilty of it too. I mean, I bring my computer to edit my podcasts over at the coffee shop, and I'm very locked into my device at that moment. But it's almost sometimes it seems frowned upon to initiate a conversation with a person, and with to initiate a conversation with a person like in that moment. But if I sent a message on Instagram or on a dating app, that would be considered acceptable. So it really shifted because in the beginning it seemed odd to like, I don't even know who you are. Why are you reaching out to me on Facebook or Instagram? And then now it's very shifted where sometimes the conversation in person is considered disconcerting and uncomfortable. I do notice that people appreciate it, but I think young people they haven't really lived in that world, so they're especially disconnected from the possibility that I can organically form a connection, friendship, intimate relationship just by interacting with a person, on a hike or. And I live in Arizona currently, so it's definitely better here because it's so nice outside. So a lot of people want to be outside, and you find connections that way. But in a lot of the places in the world, I think it's especially isolated. Um, which is tough. And um,
It's
but I
worth.
want to
Oh, go ahead. I just wanted to
no, go ahead, go
underline
ahead.
something you said, which is that, that you've seen the shift in your life, and I've really seen it in mine. But we have had thousands of years of evolution
Mm,
where our meaningful lives were built based on social interactions, based on community. And that, that has driven our civilization and our personal development. And I think that we can't just replace that, no matter what, the AI companies think. You cannot replace that. You can't just, put something virtual in its stead and
mm,
expect the same results. I think there's big interest right now in counseling that is done by bots. And, I don't think that's what's going to really solve the problem of the mental health crisis. I think what we need is to listen and hear each other.
mm.
Um, so anyway, I don't know. I guess it is a bit of a different time, but it's not without consequences.
Hmm. Yeah, we could go down a whole long rabbit hole there of the potential for transhumanist agenda and this
Mhm.
inability to actually help our people here that are, you know, occupying this world. But besides from that, I wanted to ask because again I think you alluded to this in something that I heard from you, maybe the book, but you really put so much energy into studying addiction after getting clean and sober. So what I think is cool is kind of transforming the same mechanism that would cause you to be an addict. What my question is, what really drove you to do that? Is it because you wanted to understand yourself or you wanted to understand the predicament generally? Both?
Yeah, no, I definitely only wanted to understand myself. I was completely self-focused at 23, and I really was determined to continue my drug taking. So that was my pretty selfish agenda. I think, though, it was very fortunate because, and it illustrates something that you're talking about in a way. I had this tendency to take risks and to be kind of experimental and bold and easily bored. And so it would not have worked for me, as it doesn't work for many people like me, to just say, don't do drugs,
Mm,
because nothing likes a vacuum. And I wasn't, I would go mad. And so I was really fortunate that I somehow got that idea, like I'm just going to become a neuroscientist and figure it out. And it took me a long time. People can hear about it in the book. It wasn't like I just, walked in, knocked on a graduate school and they let me in, that's for sure. But anyway, I, uh, I think that there is a lot of, and I hate to use the word because it's kind of got a bad rep, but capital, a lot of value in the tendencies that I and other people like me have to want to push the envelope, to want more.
mm,
Basically, the book is titled "Never Enough," and it's because I still want more.
mm,
It's just the way I'm built, and I think that's good. It for society. Now, maybe not if everybody's like that, but I think it's a way to expand ourselves, but also the capacity of humans. And we need people who are kind of not going to color inside the lines all the time.
mm,
And definitely, those people are more at risk for addiction, but also maybe likely to have big contributions. Now, I have colleagues who would, say, well, so we're all useful, I guess. But I think that to say that it's bad. In other words, I think the tendencies that made me a pretty good drug addict were also many of the tendencies that make me a pretty good scientist
Mm.
and professor and willing to, yeah. I'm launching a new research agenda on scientific literacy. I'm concerned about how the information that we know is not really leaking down through the social media channels where people get their information. So I'm enrolling a bunch of students from all over the world to try to translate that in a way that can be appreciated by young people.
I like that you said that what makes you a good addict also makes you a good scientist, and people do argue against that, but I think it's a better narrative to have because the same it's just that blessing and curse, the shadow and the gifts, you know, it's both. So and it's hard to have that narrative around yourself when you're struggling. I mean, I was always considered myself to like overthink everything, overanalyze, have that obsessive mind. But then I also realized over time, if I channel it in the right direction, that's what makes me good at interacting with new people and writing and creating because I'm thinking, you know, you're thinking a lot. So again, it needs a channel so that way it doesn't get put into alcohol abuse, sexual abuse, like, or
Yeah.
wrong terminology, but overusing sex, overusing these numbing agents can definitely be coping mechanisms for that obsession.
But
Um,
they silence the, and they quash kind of the unique things about ourselves. And
mhm,
I wouldn't say, we're better, but I also wouldn't say we're worse. I think it's a healthy person who doesn't quash who they are, and a healthy society that doesn't quash any person, that appreciates the different perspectives. I think it's the perspective of people who toe the line is not probably going to get us out of some of the dilemmas we're in as a society.
Look at
You
like a
know,
Jimi Hendrix. You couldn't put that guy in an accounting job. It would squash them some of the best music that was ever created.
yes,
So we each have a role.
unfortunately, he died of barbiturate overdose because he didn't. But you're right. So this is a balancing act. But I think recognizing the the advantages and the liabilities in ourselves and honoring those. So in a way, young people need more opportunities to access and develop meaning in their lives, and they'd be less inclined to find those opportunities in some little baggie.
What are your views on the sort of psychedelic renaissance and the use of psychedelics for all sorts of purposes? What are your thoughts around that?
Well, I have a lot of thoughts on it. In the book, I make the point that the psychedelics are not addictive.
Hmm.
I, though, definitely distinguish the what I call psychedelics and some other people as certain molecular action that is accomplished by drugs like LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, DMT. I don't put MDMA or ecstasy, Molly, in that category, which I think is much more like a stimulant.
Hmm.
So I think one reason this is a really cloudy topic is because those drugs have been lumped together, and I feel strongly that they should not be. MDMA, I think, is neurotoxic, might be useful in some situations, just like chemotherapy is useful if you've got stage 4 cancer. That was probably maybe a little over the top, but going back to the real psychedelics, those natural ones and LSD, I think there's good potential. The one caveat is that young people whose brains, so they really make our brains more plastic. They and open, they're mind opening, right? That's the whole thing, and that's good if you have a mind to begin with. When you're forming your mind, when you're deciding what your mind is about and what it wants and doesn't want, I think it can be a little risky. So if you
Hmm.
don't have a strong sense of self, or at least a decent sense of self and you go in that direction, I think it could be not helpful. But I, I, I think it's very exciting. They're pharmacologically exciting. I think the data is strong that they can have benefits,
Hmm.
real benefits, and certainly it's crystal clear that we don't have other great drugs to help with things like anxiety, depression, and post traumatic stress. So, yeah, it's
I
very
think
exciting.
it's wise and objective to look at MDMA in a different light, and ketamine for that matter. I think those two are propped up because they can go through the medical model more easily. I don't have enough to clearly say what's good and bad about both of those things. I mean, I have ideas, but I agree with you. Like the true psychedelics that actually have been used by cultures for a very long, different cultures for a very long time, have other medicinal properties than just being pushed through as treatments. So I think that that's intriguing, and I'm curious to see these things where it goes. What is the what do what do you see as a way to like help this problem?
Mhm.
How do you try to contribute to help with people that are struggling with addiction or that are struggling with psychological issues? What's your approach and what's your vantage from personal and a larger state?
Well, I've spent, you know, almost 40 years trying to do it, and I would say my thinking has evolved a lot. I would say, going back to the psychedelics, one big impediment is that when things can't generate profits, they don't get studied. And so, be maybe a critical consumer, because I think that, you're not maybe going to get the best information if somebody can't make a lot of money. And that is what drives a lot of the marketing and propaganda around drugs today still. And so I think it's important in general for people to inform themselves. We have never been in a position where we have such ready access to so many potent tools to mess with reality. We've always done this, we've always tried, but now it's almost too easy. So when we want to make good choices, how do you do that? And my suggestion as a scientist would be to do it with evidence, which I think is, there's no substitute for that. It's some things are, you know, more objectively true than others, which are not true, and based on hype or wishful thinking or something. So I would say to do what you can to inform yourself by listening to a podcast like this, for instance, and then I would also say be be skeptical of the quick fixes,
Mm-hmm.
because if I've learned anything, it's that there is no easy way through. We kind of have to do the hard work. So let's say my own mental health. I did escape challenges with drugs that came to an abrupt end when I was 23. I then had to kind of face my own hurdles, and that took time and attention and good friends and a lot of support. But I think in the long run, there's really no substitute for that process. It's like trying to build a cathedral, you know, in a rush. I think it's not a very beautiful or solid structure. So it takes time, and get with other people who are trying to do the same kind of thing, and work it out.
Mm. Yeah. Well, I mean, I appreciate that response, and just I'll wrap it up with you momentarily, but if is there anything else you'd like to leave people with, or maybe a perspective on how to approach, and you might have just given me that, but maybe a perspective on how to approach addiction or the idea of getting clean, and just what helped you find that like purpose and that clarity of mind? Because you seem great, you seem very like lucid and grounded. So I know it's been a long time, but
That's good. After all the weed I smoked, I'm glad. I'm sure I still have some deficits there, but um, yeah, I would say that, if it were easy to get through uh, adolescence or life in general, we would all be sailing. And it's not easy. You can just look around to see that people are struggling. And so you're not alone in that. I would also really want to emphasize the incredible potency of a young brain to change and shape the future. And if there is ever a resource that we should all get behind, it is an adolescent's neurons. Yeah, they're what's inside their skull, and I
mm,
think they need that needs to be recognized and cherished and supported. And if you can do that by yourself, I'd be surprised. But I think asking for help, finding connections, putting the devices away, and
mm,
just sitting on a park bench with somebody who's young
mm.
is likely to be much more fruitful.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time this morning, Judy. Really appreciate you.
You're so welcome. It's a pleasure.
Thanks for tuning in, guys. Remember to like the show, follow, subscribe. I'm available on YouTube and Spotify. Thank you.